The battlefield had fallen silent, but silence itself was a scream that refused to fade. Smoke coiled upward in slow, mournful spirals, carrying with it the scent of burning flesh and sanctified oil, a grotesque perfume of victory. The air was thick, heavy with ash, sweat, and the copper tang of blood that never seemed to dry. Beneath the twisted remains of shattered lances and the carcasses of war horses, bodies lay tangled in unnatural embraces, friend and foe indistinguishable beneath the filth of conquest. Crows had begun to gather, black specks against a bruised sky, waiting for the living to finish what death had begun. And among this ruin, moving like shadows through the smoke, came the Crusaders, men whose armor gleamed not with holy light, but with the reflection of the flames they had kindled in God's name. In the distance, the wives of the fallen waited. They had seen the banners rise, heard the hymns shouted over the roar of slaughter, and felt the earth shake as their husbands were crushed beneath the boots of salvation. Some clutched their children to their chests. Others stared into the horizon where the sun bled into the sand, whispering names of men who would never return. They thought they knew what awaited them. They had heard stories from villages swallowed before theirs, stories of plunder, of violation, of chains. Yet what these women would endure was something different, something colder than violence, more permanent than death. It was a cruelty refined by belief, sharpened by ritual, and sanctified by the very cross that crowned the Crusaders' standards. For in those moments after victory, when the cries had faded and the spoils were gathered, the true conquest began, not of cities or gold, but of flesh, spirit, and memory. The Crusaders believed they were cleansing the world of impurity, but what they created instead was a theater of damnation, where faith became a weapon and suffering a sacrament. Before we step deeper into this forbidden shadow of history, make sure you subscribe and join us as we unearth the darkest corners of the past, because what the Crusaders did to the wives of defeated warriors was not merely an act of cruelty. It was the invention of a punishment that made death seem merciful. To understand the horrors that awaited the wives of the fallen, one must first step into the world that made such horrors possible, a world where faith was not a private devotion, but a weapon sharpened by centuries of fear and fervor. It was the age of the Crusades, those blood-soaked pilgrimages proclaimed by popes and sung by preachers as journeys to cleanse the earth of infidels and reclaim the sepulchre of Christ. From the pulpits of Europe's cathedrals, men in gilded vestments promised forgiveness not through prayer, but through slaughter. The peasant who had known only mud and hunger was told that his sins could be washed away if only he would cross the sea and kill in the name of God. Kings and nobles saw divine sanction for conquest. Merchants saw gold where others saw salvation. And so an army of believers rose from the soil of Christendom, hungry, restless, convinced that every swing of their sword carried them closer to paradise. The First Crusade in 1096 was not born of holiness but hysteria. When Pope Urban II declared that those who fought to reclaim Jerusalem would be granted eternal remission, the word spread like a fever. Thousands sold their land, abandoned their homes, and branded themselves with the cross, believing the pilgrimage eastward would be their rebirth. Yet what reached the Holy Land was not an army of saints, but of men consumed by desperation and sanctified rage. They marched through Europe leaving trails of blood, sacking Jewish villages and massacring those they were not even sent to fight, for the boundaries between heretic and heathen blurred when righteousness tasted like steel. The idea of the enemy became a sacred mirror. Anyone who did not share the Crusaders' creed became less than human, a creature to be purged, a body to be owned, a soul to be saved through suffering. When the Crusaders finally reached the walls of Jerusalem, their faith had long since transformed into frenzy. Chroniclers from the era, those trembling scribes who dared to describe what they saw, spoke of rivers of blood flowing through the streets of the city. Muslims, Jews, even Eastern Christians were slaughtered indiscriminately. Entire families burned alive inside their homes as hymns echoed over the carnage. The victors marched through the holy streets barefoot, singing praises, their swords still dripping with the blood of the very people they claimed to redeem. This was not war, as the ancients had known it. It was purification by annihilation, a new kind of violence in which piety masked predation. To them, conquest was not theft, it was divine inheritance. Every act of cruelty was sanctified as service to God, and the victim's screams became a kind of choir, proof that evil had been exorcised. It is in this moral abyss that the fate of the conquered women must be understood. In medieval Christendom, a woman's worth was chained to her husband's honor, her body a vessel of lineage and faith. When her husband fell, her existence became a battlefield of another kind, a space upon which victors could inscribe their dominance. The Crusaders believed that through possession, through forced baptism or forced union, they could erase the bloodlines of their enemies and rewrite them with their own sanctified seed. To them, this was not desecration but divine correction, the conversion of the flesh itself. And so, after the sieges were over, when the smoke cleared and the dead were stripped of armor, the wives who remained became living tributes to conquest. Their tears were not only grief for the men they lost, but for the personhood that was about to be taken from them in the name of God. The laws of the time reflected this monstrous logic. Under feudal order, the right of seizure extended to both land and women. The conqueror claimed not just the spoils of war, but the continuity of the defeated. Clergy who marched with crusader armies turned scripture into justification, preaching that the subjugation of infidel women was an act of mercy, saving their souls by binding them to Christian husbands. The Church's silence, or worse, its blessings, created a sanctified lawlessness in which women's bodies became the instruments of cultural erasure. They were forced into marriages that were not unions but punishments, paraded as trophies in cities they once called home, baptized beneath the same hands that had slaughtered their families. To refuse was to die, but to submit was to become something neither living nor free. Behind the armor and the banners, the Crusaders were still men driven by lust, fear, and the intoxicating belief that God watched through their eyes. Many chroniclers wrote of miracles and triumphs, yet in their margins lie whispers of what truly happened behind the walls after each city fell. The soldiers who could not plunder gold took flesh instead, and those who sought forgiveness found it in the tears of the conquered. For every prayer that rose toward heaven, a woman's cry was buried beneath it, unheard, unnamed, unremembered. And in that silence, something darker than conquest took root, a ritual of domination, carried out not in rage but in ceremony, as though cruelty itself had been canonized. By the end of the 12th century, the Crusades had become a system, a cycle of violence disguised as virtue. Each generation of knights carried with them the myth of divine war, but also the habits of desecration passed quietly from one campaign to the next. And as Europe celebrated tales of valor and salvation, the women left behind in the ashes of Antioch, Acre, and Jerusalem became phantoms of history. Their names were erased, their suffering turned into rumor, their fates reduced to footnotes in chronicles written by the victors. Yet their silence was not emptiness. It was an echo that still trembles beneath the stones of the Holy Land. For when the Crusaders raised the cross, they did not bring light to the east. They brought a darkness so profound that even centuries later its shadow still falls across the memory of mankind. When the swords fell silent and the cries of the dying faded into the whispers of wind over ruined walls, a different kind of war began. It was not the clash of steel but the slow unraveling of humanity itself, a cruelty more deliberate than bloodshed, more enduring than fire. For the wives and daughters left behind after each Crusader victory, survival did not mean escape. It meant endurance within a living nightmare sanctified by faith and ritual. The smoke of battle might have cleared, but what remained in its place was a darkness far more intimate. These women were not slaughtered because death was too merciful. They were kept alive, claimed, reshaped, and turned into the living emblems of defeat, so that the victors could savor conquest not just over land, but over blood and memory. The first stage was always the same, the pillage and the silence that followed. The Crusaders, their bodies still slick with sweat and dust, would move through the ruins of captured towns like priests through a desecrated temple, searching for offerings. They called it spoils, a word that turned horror into reward. Behind them trailed priests and heralds chanting victory hymns, their voices rising over the muffled sobs of women gathered in the streets. Those who resisted were cut down, and those who did not were herded together, trembling beneath the weight of armor and the stench of wine-soaked breath. Many were stripped not only of their veils and jewels, but of the very dignity that bound them to the memory of their slain husbands. For the Crusaders, humiliation was not chaos. It was theater. Every act of degradation reaffirmed their dominion. Every tear drawn from a captive's face was proof that heaven itself favored their conquest. And yet, amidst this madness, there were moments of chilling control. A soldier offering a cup of water only to spill it over a woman's bowed head, laughing as if baptizing her into her new life of servitude. It was cruelty masked as ritual, order imposed upon ruin. From this chaos emerged a twisted economy of purity. The wives and daughters of defeated warriors were no longer individuals but symbols, living trophies paraded as evidence of Christian triumph. Their beauty, once revered in their households, now became a currency traded between knights and nobles. Captives were marched through the streets of captured cities like Jerusalem and Ma'arat al-Numan, dressed in the remnants of their silks, forced to sing hymns in a language they did not understand. Some were presented before priests who declared them cleansed through suffering, as though forced conversion could redeem both conqueror and conquered. Others were chosen by commanders to become wives in name only, baptized not in water but in the tears of their humiliation. The Crusaders believed themselves instruments of divine will, purging the infidel through possession. Yet what they practiced was not salvation but desecration, a spiritual inversion where rape became ritual and faith a justification for torment. Chroniclers of the time, their hands trembling over parchment, described these acts with vague language: the purification of the East, the taming of heathen blood, as if words themselves could not bear the weight of the truth they hid. Worse still was the fate of those taken to what came to be called the houses of the living dead, makeshift camps and monasteries turned prisons where captured women were confined under the watch of monks and soldiers alike. Here the language of holiness cloaked the machinery of degradation. By day, prayers echoed through the halls. By night, whispers of despair filled the same air that carried hymns. Some women were starved until they agreed to baptism. Others were forced into silent obedience, their identities scrubbed away through endless repetition of prayers in Latin. A few gave birth within those walls, children born not of love but of conquest, offspring of violence destined to belong nowhere. These children were marked from birth, neither accepted by the Crusaders nor welcomed by the people of their mothers. Their existence was an unspoken curse, a living testament to the crime of blood rewritten by faith. For the women who bore them, there was no escape from the mirror of their suffering. Their wombs had been transformed into instruments of cultural annihilation. Public humiliation soon became a form of celebration. In the grand feasts following victories, the wives of fallen warriors were forced to serve wine and bread to the very men who had destroyed their world. In torchlit halls, laughter and music mixed with the scent of roasted meat and fear. The conquerors toasted to Christendom while the captives moved silently between tables, their faces blank masks of endurance. Sometimes, for amusement, knights would command them to dance to foreign tunes, their movements slow and mechanical, while priests looked on with approving smiles, declaring it a triumph over the heathen spirit. Every gesture, every humiliation was choreographed to reaffirm the hierarchy between the saved and the damned. The Crusaders told themselves that they were teaching humility, that through subjugation these women might find grace. But grace was never their gift to give. It was only the word they hid behind, to mask their appetite for power. And then there were the unspoken horrors, those acts too shameful to record but too frequent to forget. Whispers spread through the Crusader camps of nunneries of the redeemed, secret compounds where captured women were kept under the guise of religious instruction but were, in truth, used as instruments of pleasure and breeding. Here, the line between faith and depravity vanished entirely. The men who entered these chambers crossed themselves before they did their deeds, whispering prayers that turned blasphemy into blessing. Many of the women taken there did not survive. Those who did were ghosts long before their bodies died, their minds fractured beyond return. Some chose the only freedom left to them: suicide, starvation, or the desperate act of taking the lives of their own children so that they might not inherit the curse of conquest. For these women, death was not a tragedy, but a release from a fate deliberately designed to be worse than death. By the time the Crusades reached their later centuries, this cruelty had become routine, a shadow ritual written into the rhythm of war. The Church did not speak of it, and the chroniclers reduced it to euphemisms. But among the ruins of cities, among the bones buried beneath cathedrals, their silence still lingers. It is said that on certain nights, the wind over Jerusalem carries the echo of women's cries, low, broken sounds that belong neither to prayer nor to grief. Perhaps they are not cries at all, but warnings, whispers from the past reminding us that the worst atrocities are not always those committed in rage, but those carried out in the name of salvation. In the final years of the Crusader campaigns, when kingdoms had risen and crumbled like sandcastles beneath the tide of war, the machinery of conquest had become something disturbingly refined. Violence was no longer wild or impulsive. It had been ritualized, codified, blessed by law and by liturgy. The slaughter that had once been a chaotic frenzy of blood and zeal had evolved into a system of control that fused bureaucracy with belief. The Crusaders had learned how to make domination sustainable, how to weave oppression into the fabric of life so tightly that it became indistinguishable from order. The atrocities committed against the wives and daughters of fallen warriors were no longer the reckless cruelties of battle. They were the deliberate operations of a society that had discovered how to turn suffering into structure. Behind every siege, behind every burned city, stood not only the knight with his sword but the priest with his scripture, the clerk with his parchment, the ruler with his seal, and each, in their own way, ensured that what had begun as sin could be sanctified through procedure. What made these horrors truly enduring was not their savagery, but their sanctity. The Church, which had promised redemption through faith, became the silent architect of despair. Indulgences were offered to those who fought, papal blessings bestowed upon those who killed, and when whispers arose of what was being done to the conquered women, the answers came cloaked in Scripture. Through their submission, one chronicler wrote, the faithless are purified. It was theology as anesthetic, language turned into a veil that disguised barbarity as virtue. The women who were taken, broken, baptized, and bound were not merely victims, they were made to play roles in a grotesque theater of salvation. Their forced conversions and marriages were called acts of mercy. Their violation was described as spiritual correction. And while Europe celebrated its triumphs with songs and relics, the true relics of the Crusades lay buried in nameless graves, beneath the ruins of once living cities, beneath the silence of women whose voices were erased before they could even cry for help. The chronicles that survive from those centuries are filled with contradictions, pages dripping with piety yet stained with violence, declarations of God's will written beside accounts of rivers running red. Historians would later read these contradictions as the confusion of war, but they were not confusion at all, they were confession. The Crusaders understood, at least dimly, the nature of their crimes. Some wrote of visions in which the faces of the conquered haunted their dreams, of nights where the hymns of the faithful turned to wailing in their ears. Others sought absolution in pilgrimage or penance, but the institutions that had unleashed them offered none. To admit the truth would have been to unravel the moral architecture of an entire civilization. So the Church buried it beneath Latin euphemisms, beneath the glories of relics and Crusader saints, beneath the grand myth that the wars of the cross had been wars of light. The truth was too obscene, too corrosive to the image of holiness that Europe needed to preserve. And so the suffering of those women became a silence that lasted centuries, a silence enforced by sanctity. It was not just bodies that were conquered in these years, it was bloodlines. Through forced unions and coerced baptisms, entire families were dissolved, their names erased from lineage records, their children renamed and rebranded as Christborn. Generations of identity were systematically rewritten. In some Crusader states, laws were passed forbidding the offspring of mixed blood from inheriting land or title, ensuring that these children lived on the margins, reminders of conquest, yet excluded from belonging. In this way, the Crusaders not only defeated nations, but rewrote ancestry itself. The bodies of women became the battleground upon which civilization was rewritten, a tool through which memory was cleansed and history itself remade in the image of the conqueror. The cruelty was not only in the act, but in the endurance of its consequences. Every child born of such violence carried the legacy of conquest in their veins, and every mother forced to bear them carried the unending grief of being both victim and vessel of her people's erasure. The Church's greatest achievement was not victory over Jerusalem or Antioch, but the invention of moral blindness, a blindness so profound that it allowed generations to look upon evil and call it divine. In cathedrals built from the spoils of war, priests preached of compassion beneath frescoes painted with gold stolen from the East, their sermons echoing across stones laid by hands once enslaved. The nobility of Europe boasted of their ancestors who had fought for Christ, but their songs of valor were built on the bones of women who had been turned into symbols of defeat. And as centuries passed, the atrocities faded into myth, their edges softened by time and retelling, until what had been atrocity became legend, and what had been legend became heritage. The Crusades were remembered as noble, romantic, righteous. Few spoke of the horrors, and fewer still of the women who endured them. But the land remembers what people forget. In the ruins of the Levant, in the quiet monasteries of old Crusader states, and in the bones unearthed beneath churches, traces remain, rings found on skeletal fingers, foreign ornaments buried in European soil, fragments of lives severed and scattered by conquest. Archaeologists have uncovered remains of women with foreign ornaments buried beside Crusader men, their bones showing signs of violence even in death. These are the remnants of what history refused to speak aloud. That the Holy War was also a war against womanhood, against continuity, against the right to exist unclaimed. The cross that adorned the Crusaders' banners was not a symbol of salvation in these places, it was a brand, burned into the flesh of history itself. And so, as we reach this darkest point of revelation, the truth becomes unbearable, yet undeniable. The Crusaders did not just slaughter their enemies, they colonized their descendants, rewrote their faith, and turned the very act of survival into an eternal punishment. What they called victory was nothing more than the sanctification of cruelty, a theology built upon the suffering of the innocent. They believed they were building God's kingdom, but what they truly built was a monument to human depravity, a structure so vast and so enduring that its shadow still lies across the conscience of the modern world. For when violence is blessed, when domination is disguised as redemption, and when faith itself becomes the justification for erasure, what emerges is not holiness. It is horror wearing the mask of heaven. Centuries have passed since the banners of the Crusaders were lowered, since the clang of their armor faded into the dust, yet the shadows they cast remain. History, in its hunger for glory, has often washed the stains of blood from its own pages, polishing the past until only heroism gleams. The chronicles that survived were written by the victors, men who called their conquests holy and their cruelty divine. The wives of the slain, the women who bore the weight of vengeance disguised as salvation, were erased not only from memory but from meaning itself. Their stories were buried beneath the stones of cathedrals, beneath sermons that praised the purity of faith while standing upon the graves of those faith destroyed. And yet, though their names are lost, the echo of their suffering has never truly vanished. It lives in the unmarked graves across the Levant, in the ruins where laughter once lived, in the trembling lineage of those born of conquest, who carried within them both the blood of oppressor and oppressed. The silence of those women became the foundation upon which history built its myths, a silence heavy enough to suffocate truth for generations. To reflect upon these horrors is to confront a truth that stretches beyond time, that evil rarely knows itself as evil when it wears the robes of righteousness. The Crusaders did not believe they were monsters, they believed they were saviors. And that is what makes their crimes endure, not merely the brutality of their acts, but the moral certainty with which they were committed. When faith is transformed into armor and mercy into conquest, when the divine is invoked to justify domination, humanity corrodes from within. The wives who were broken, baptized, and bound became unwilling martyrs of this corruption, their pain a mirror reflecting the hypocrisy of a civilization that preached salvation through suffering. Their erasure was deliberate, for remembrance is rebellion. To remember them is to unravel the illusion that history was ever holy. The victors wrote of Jerusalem as redeemed, but the city they left behind was not holy, it was haunted. And yet there is something almost defiant in the endurance of their silence. It lingers not as emptiness but as testimony, a whisper that resists forgetting. Every time we speak of the Crusades as glory, we summon their ghosts. Every time we call those wars sacred, their shadows stir. The lesson they leave us is not only about the brutality of the past, but the fragility of morality when cloaked in certainty. Even today, wars are waged in the language of faith and freedom, ideologies brand themselves as salvation, and the bodies of the powerless still bear the weight of belief turned to violence. History may change its names and flags, but the pattern endures: the same blindness, the same sanctified cruelty, the same silence. So as this tale closes, ask yourself, not what they did, for we have seen it, but what we have learned. How many more times will faith be forged into a weapon? How many more lives will be buried beneath the weight of a cause too holy to question? The Crusaders are gone, but the idea that birthed them survives, wearing new faces, carrying new banners, and still whispering that sin committed in God's name is no sin at all. Remember the wives who lived and died in those shadows, whose suffering was worse than death, not because it ended life, but because it stripped it of meaning. Their silence is history's indictment, and our remembrance its only absolution. Before you leave, consider this: history is not written by the righteous, it is written by those who refuse to look away. If this glimpse into humanity's darkest faith unsettled you, subscribe and walk with us again into the places history fears to reveal. Tell us, what part of this darkness will you remember when the light fades?